I woke up early on a crisp, dew-laden spring morning, eager to check on the new seedlings in my small orchard. Harvest season was still months away, but I had big plans: organically grown apples, pears, and maybe a row of blueberry bushes. The smell of wet earth and budding flowers always reminded me why I fell in love with this patch of land. It might have been only a few acres, but to me, it was a kingdom. My family had purchased this old farmland around 15 years ago, shortly after my father retired from the military. I inherited it when he passed. Over time, I'd built a modest but comfortable ranch house, a vegetable garden, and a barn with a weathered tin roof that rattled in high winds. Even though the city had grown around it, I took pride in maintaining the farm's rustic charm. The morning air was always peppered with birdsong and the gentle rustle of wind through tall grass. That morning, however, things took a strange turn. As I checked the mailbox, I found an official-looking envelope. Inside was a notice typed in bold letters: "Cease and desist, violations of neighborhood guidelines." The signature, scrawled in an overconfident flourish, read Karen Wilcox, President, Briarwood Estates, HOA. I stared at the letter, trying to make sense of it. My farm sat on the edge of a new subdivision that had sprung up over the past few years. Its row of cookie-cutter houses lined the new asphalt roads like clones. I'd heard rumors from other local folks about how strict the Briarwood Estates Homeowners Association was. But I wasn't a member. My property was grandfathered into its own agricultural zoning, predating the neighborhood. The letter threatened fines and disciplinary actions if I didn't comply with some sort of code. But how could an HOA have jurisdiction over a farm that wasn't even part of their development? I took a breath, attempting to keep my annoyance in check. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding. Over the years, I'd had small disagreements with new neighbors. Sometimes they objected to the smell of manure or the noise from my tractor. But after a friendly conversation, we typically found a compromise. I decided I would contact this Karen Wilcox, clarify the situation, and hopefully settle things like adults. That same afternoon, I made a quick trip into town for feed supplies. On my way back, a woman in a neatly pressed pantsuit waved me down at the start of my driveway. She was in her mid-50s, hairstyled in a severe bob, large sunglasses perched on her nose. The universal sign of a bureaucratic busybody. "May I help you?" I asked, rolling down my truck window. "I'm Karen Wilcox, Briarwood Estates, HOA President. You must be the farm owner, Mr. Underwood." Her tone suggested she was conferring some sort of regal blessing by addressing me. I nodded, noticing she eyed my mud-streaked pickup truck with a curl of distaste on her lip. "That's right. I just received a rather confusing notice about neighborhood guidelines. My property isn't." She clucked her tongue and raised a hand in a shushing motion. "I need you to understand something. Your fence line abuts our pristine community, and your property is an eyesore. We have new residents moving in all the time, and we pride ourselves on uniformity." I forced my shoulders to remain calm. "Ma'am, with respect, my family's been here a long time. This land isn't part of your HOA. I'm not sure how you have any say in what I do." Karen adjusted her sunglasses, scanning my driveway. "The line is a little blurry, don't you think? My records show that our covenant covers not just the new houses, but also extends an aesthetic guideline to any adjacent properties within 500 feet of the border." I raised an eyebrow. "That's not how the law works. You can't just impose your regulations on someone else's agricultural land. My father had a contract with the county that designated this as farmland indefinitely." Her lips thinned. "We'll just have to see about that. In the meantime, consider this your official warning." Her eyes flicked to the barn. "That rusted heap of metal is lowering property values, and the chickens roaming around could be a health hazard. We have children who play in those backyards, you know." Before I could argue further, she snapped her posture straight and marched off with a disapproving huff. I watched her walk away, a swirl of frustration churning inside me. I'd dealt with difficult neighbors before, but she took it to another level entirely. She had a way of talking like she was reading off a script, one that ended with her always being right. As I parked my truck next to the barn, I considered how best to handle the situation. Given her demeanor, I sensed that a polite conversation alone wouldn't fix this. Karen was the type who thought she could bend reality to her will, and if that didn't work, she'd try something more forceful. I rubbed my forehead, already feeling the headache of a looming battle. But that farm was my life, my heritage, my father's legacy, and my future. I'd be darned if I let some overzealous HOA president bully me into submission. One thing was certain. Karen Wilcox had declared war, and I was going to hold my ground. I wish I could say Karen Wilcox backed off after that initial confrontation, but that would be too easy. Within a week, I discovered a flurry of anonymous complaints filed with various county offices. Suddenly, inspectors started popping up at odd hours, citing me for everything from potential noise violations to suspected contamination from fertilizer runoff. While none of these citations stuck, I followed all regulations meticulously. They still caused me wasted time, stress, and fees for inspections I hadn't budgeted for. It became clear that Karen was the puppeteer behind these sudden visits. She'd found her way into the ear of an overworked county employee or two, painting a dire picture of farm animals running amok and toxins leaking into the suburban water table. I've been in this county long enough to have good relationships with some local officials, so eventually the complaints fizzled out. But the message was loud and clear. She was not going away. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of Karen striding around the perimeter of my fence with a measuring tape or snapping pictures of my livestock. She seemed determined to make a case that I was in violation of some mysterious, far-reaching rule. Occasionally, younger members of the HOA joined her, people who'd only lived in the area a few months but already spoke about protecting community standards. One afternoon, after I'd just finished repairing a broken gate hinge, I saw Karen standing on the other side of the fence, wearing a sun hat that rivaled something you'd see at the Kentucky Derby. She was muttering into her phone, presumably describing some new offense. My patience snapped. "Ma'am," I called, walking over. "If you have an issue, why not talk to me face-to-face instead of skulking around with a camera?" She turned, lips set in a thin, humorless smile. "I'm documenting problems for our upcoming HOA meeting. We have the right to gather evidence." "Evidence of what?" I demanded. "That I have a working farm? That's not a crime." Her nostrils flared. "The stench from your compost piles has become unbearable. And the rooster. Do you have any idea how disruptive it is for our residents to hear crowing at the crack of dawn?" I bit my tongue, thinking how roosters have been crowing at dawn on this land for over a century. "Look, I'm not opposed to being neighborly. I can move the compost bins further from the fence. But the rooster stays. He's a vital part of the farm's ecosystem." Her gaze flickered with contempt. "I'm telling you now, we're going to impose our rules. If you don't comply, you'll face legal consequences." "Good luck with that," I said, spinning on my heel and stomping off, furious. That evening, while rummaging through old deeds and zoning documents my father had stored in the basement, I found something interesting. The original farmland charter from the mid-1900s, complete with county stamps. It guaranteed that so long as the land remained used for agricultural purposes, no subsequent zoning changes or local ordinances could force the farm out. I'd known it existed, but never had a reason to read it in such detail. The language was ironclad. If Karen tried to push a lawsuit, she'd likely lose. However, she wasn't going the straightforward route. She was waging a war of attrition. Over the next month, her tattling and harassing phone calls to the county left me drowning in paperwork. I stayed up nights drafting explanations and scanning old receipts to prove I wasn't using illegal pesticides or feeding my chickens with harmful substances. It felt like every week brought another wave of complaint forms. Worst of all, she started dragging my name through the mud in the neighborhood's social circles. A few longtime neighbors, folks who'd known my father, came to my defense, sharing stories of how my farm donated fresh produce to a local food pantry. But the new arrivals, those who only saw farmland as a threat to their neat suburban bubble, tended to side with Karen. Rumors spread about me spraying toxic chemicals or operating heavy machinery at all hours, none of it true. I tried to stay civil, but at times frustration boiled over. My orchard had just started blossoming, and the sweet scent of new flowers should have been cause for celebration. Instead, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was plotting her next move, lurking somewhere behind those newly built fences in Briarwood Estates. My suspicion proved correct. One late afternoon, I heard frantic honking outside. Hurrying out, I found a sheriff's deputy at my gate. He looked exasperated. "Mr. Underwood, mind if I come in?" I led him up to the porch, offered him a seat. "What's this about?" He sighed. "We got a complaint that your livestock is crossing property lines into the subdivision. Specifically, a large pig reportedly wandered onto someone's lawn and caused damage." I stared at him, stunned. I don't know pigs. I had chickens, goats, and a pair of horses, but not a single pig. The deputy and I exchanged a look that said it all. This was bogus. "Look, you and I both know who's behind this," I said. "I appreciate you coming out, but I have no pigs, and I'm not in violation of any county regs." He nodded wearily. "I figured as much. We still have to file a visit report, but I'll mark the complaint unsubstantiated." As he drove off, I spotted Karen's familiar silhouette by the road, arms folded, observing like a self-appointed warden. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, I realized she wasn't just being petty, she was escalating. The next phase of her war had begun, and I wasn't sure how far she'd go. My father used to say, "Never pick a fight with someone who has nothing left to lose." But that didn't apply here. I had my entire farm at stake. My livelihood, my father's dream. And Karen seemed determined to wrestle control from me, or at least destroy my peace in the process. A couple of weeks rolled by with relatively minimal drama, if you don't count Karen's daily perimeter checks and the occasional complaint about suspicious tractor noise. But I knew her lull was likely a tactic, not a retreat. Sure enough, near the end of May, I discovered a bizarre development. A brand new fence had appeared overnight, cutting across a portion of my property line. Well, it attempted to anyway. The wooden posts and chain-link panels marched right up to a few feet short of my orchard, as if someone intended to annex part of my land for the subdivision. I stood there, hands on my hips, seething. A few hours later, an older neighbor named Floyd drove up in his golf cart and confirmed my suspicions. "I saw Karen out here last evening with some contractors," he said quietly. "She was telling them to put up a fence to define the HOA boundary. I tried telling them that land belongs to you, but she insisted. It was an audacious move, but also unbelievably reckless. She'd effectively trespassed by installing a fence on land she didn't own." 1,000 responses fired through my mind, from tearing down the fence in righteous anger to calling the authorities. But I decided on a more measured approach. I spent the next day gathering documents, property surveys, boundary lines from the county, and the farmland charter that clearly proved I owned that strip of land. Then I placed a call to a local attorney friend, Emily Turner, who specialized in real estate disputes. Emily listened intently, and by the next morning, we drafted a cease and desist letter of our own, specifically addressing the unauthorized fence and the repeated harassment. That same week, Karen's HOA had a general meeting at their fancy community clubhouse. Supposedly, it was just for residents, but I'd learned from Floyd and a few sympathetic neighbors that the fence issue was on the agenda. Floyd convinced me to come and defend myself, promising to escort me in. Walking into that clubhouse was like stepping onto the set of some sterile reality show. Rows of pristine chairs faced a podium draped with the HOA's official banner. Karen stood at the front, flanked by a few board members who looked equally rigid. As soon as I entered, the chatter in the room quieted to a tense hush. Karen's eyes narrowed. "We're here to discuss pressing neighborhood matters," she began, her voice amplified by a small microphone. "Most urgently, the farmland next to our community is causing serious violations, and it's time we take collective action." I raised my hand. "Excuse me, since I'm the owner of that farmland, I'd like to respond." Karen pretended to look surprised. "Mr. Underwood, this is a private HOA meeting. You're not a member. You really shouldn't be here." Floyd, sitting near the back, cleared his throat loudly. "He's my guest, Karen, and we all know this involves him." Karen's mask of politeness faltered, but she gestured for me to speak. I stepped forward, my heart beating a little faster than I would have liked. "First, I want to address the fence you had erected. It's on my land, which you have zero right to claim. I have all the legal paperwork to prove it. This letter, I held up the attorney's notice, makes it clear you need to remove it. Immediately, murmurs rippled through the room. A man in a crisp button-up shirt stood. Wait, so the HOA doesn't own that land? That's correct, I replied. My family bought and zoned this property decades ago. I'm fully compliant with agricultural regulations, and the farmland charter protects my rights. Karen snatched the microphone. We have reason to believe our covenants extend to that adjacent land. And let's not forget the numerous noise and health complaints from residents. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on me. Those complaints have been investigated. Nothing's been substantiated. Now, I'm asking you politely, remove your fence or face legal consequences. Karen's lips thinned, but she forced a smile. We'll let our legal counsel review your so-called paperwork. With that, she wrapped up the meeting in a huff, leaving me with a mixture of triumph and lingering unease. Sure, I made my point, but Karen didn't strike me as someone who'd surrender gracefully. If anything, a public confrontation would only sharpen her appetite for conflict. True to form, she escalated again. 2 days later, a local official from the Environmental Health Department arrived, claiming they'd received evidence of improper chemical use. She handed me a complaint form with some dubious pictures attached, pictures that appeared to show random drums of toxic waste. I nearly laughed. None of it was even on my property. The background was some other farm entirely, or maybe even a stock photo from the internet. Still, it took me an hour to walk her through my storage shed, point out each labeled fertilizer bag, and show that all were organic, widely approved for agricultural use. The worst part, she admitted sympathetically, is that any complaint triggers an investigation, even if it's bogus. Unfortunately, people abuse the system. I thank her for being thorough and professional. Then, after she left, I stared out at my fields, letting frustration mix with the determination to see this through. Karen was playing a game of whack-a-mole, using every possible angle to disrupt my life. But I had no intention of backing down. Later that afternoon, Emily, my attorney friend, called with news. She'd just gotten off the phone with the HOA's law firm, who sounded surprisingly cautious. It seemed that once they saw my property documents, they realized Karen might be leading them into a losing battle. That's when it dawned on me. Karen was likely acting on her own, pushing the HOA board harder than they were comfortable with. That revelation gave me a glimmer of hope. If I could show other board members that Karen's vendetta was reckless and financially risky, maybe they'd rein her in. And if that failed, we always had the legal route. A judge wouldn't look kindly on unauthorized fence building, frivolous complaints, or the attempt to impose HOA rules outside their jurisdiction. But I also braced myself. Karen had come this far after all. Logic or caution didn't seem to be her strong suit. With summer fast approaching, peak farming season, I was steeling myself for whatever new storm she might conjure. Summer arrived in a blaze of sunshine and humid afternoons. My orchard ripened, fruit hanging like ornaments among lush green leaves. It should have been one of my happiest seasons. Selling fresh produce at the local farmers market was always a highlight, and I enjoyed seeing repeat customers who cherished the taste of old-fashioned, homegrown apples. But Karen's looming presence dampened the usual joy. In early June, she orchestrated her grandest stunt yet. I woke up to the roar of heavy machinery, the kind you'd use for road work or demolition. Alarmed, I dashed outside, only to see a large excavator blocking part of my driveway. Behind it, a line of construction trucks rumbled, carrying massive loads of gravel and lumber. Karen, clad in a bright orange safety vest, for appearances only, I was sure, stood beside the excavator operator, pointing directions as if she were the foreman. I approached cautiously. "What's going on?" I shouted over the machine's noise. She turned, that smug expression plastered across her face. "Road expansion for the Briarwood Estates recreation path. We've decided to build a walkway for our residents, and the best route is across this section. Don't worry, we'll put up signage." For a second, I was too stunned to speak. She couldn't possibly think she had a right to tear through my property for her little walkway. "This is private land," I finally sputtered. Karen smirked. The subdivision's plan includes green spaces. We're using an existing county easement. I stared in disbelief. The existing county easement she referred to was for underground utilities, buried cables that occasionally needed maintenance. It did not allow them to pave a public walking path through my fields. But Karen had twisted the interpretation, and she'd hired a construction crew to break ground, hoping I'd be too slow or intimidated to stop it. My hands were shaking with anger. "Shut down," I said. "Now." She shrugged. "Our permits are in order." I marched back inside, called Emily, and recounted the fiasco. Within 30 minutes, she arrived on site, legal documents in tow. She confronted the construction foreman, brandishing maps and a county-issued clarification on the easement's limit. Realizing they'd stepped into a potential lawsuit, the foreman ordered his crew to stand down. Karen, however, refused to budge until the county official who oversees easements arrived. After a tense hour of phone calls and argument, a county representative finally showed up. He looked over the legal definitions, then declared the walkway construction to be unauthorized. The easement was strictly for maintenance of buried utilities, no permanent structures, no pathways. Karen stood there, face turning crimson as he explained that she was in violation of county code. I expected her to back off, but she doubled down, insisting that her HOA had verbal authorization from someone in the county planning office. The county rep shook his head and politely suggested she gather her crew and leave. It was a surreal sight. Karen refused to move, arms crossed, while the entire construction team awkwardly packed up. Finally, one of the other HOA board members who'd shown up convinced her to step away before the sheriff got involved. That night, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion, but I still sensed the dam would break soon. Karen had burned so many bridges, harassing local officials, embarrassing the HOA board by leading them into illegal territory. She was close to a final reckoning. Within a week, that reckoning arrived. I heard through Floyd that the HOA board was in turmoil. Karen had spent a small fortune of the HOA's funds on preliminary construction fees, without proper votes or approvals. Furious residents demanded an audit. A special emergency board meeting was called, and apparently Karen tried to pin the blame on everyone but herself. When that didn't stick, she started making wild accusations about me, claiming I manipulated the county. No one believed her. The sweet karma moment came when the HOA members realized they might be liable for trespassing and property damage if I pressed charges, something I had every right to do. At that emergency meeting, a majority of the board voted to remove Karen from her presidency. Legal action against her personally was even discussed, though I'm not certain whether it went anywhere. Still, it was a dramatic downfall for the once dominant queen bee of Briarwood Estates. A few days later, I was out in the orchard, checking on the progress of my apple harvest, when an unfamiliar sedan rolled up my driveway. Out stepped a nervous-looking woman, mid-40s, holding a clipboard. She introduced herself as Sharon, the new interim president of the HOA. She'd come to broker peace. "Mr. Underwood, I'm so sorry about all that's happened. The board never approved those extreme actions." Karen acted on her own. I nodded warily. "I appreciate the apology, but the fence is still up along part of my property, and I have a large swath of churned-up dirt from where the excavator tried to tear through for that walkway." She swallowed. "Of course. We'd like to remove the fence immediately, repair any damage, and hopefully start fresh. We respect your farmland." Though I was still resentful about the months of harassment, I recognized that this wasn't Sharon's fault, nor the fault of many residents who likely had no clue what Karen had been up to. So I agreed. As long as I'm compensated for the repairs and the fence is removed, I won't press further charges. That Sunday, a group of HOA volunteers showed up bright and early, disassembling the unauthorized fence. They hauled away the chain-link sections, smoothed out the churned soil, and spread new grass seed. Some even helped clear a section of brush that had grown wild near the orchard, a friendly gesture I appreciated. Floyd rolled by in his golf cart to watch. After weeks of tension, it was almost festive, neighbors chatting and laughing. It reminded me that most folks, given a chance, are decent. We're all just trying to live our lives. It's when a person like Karen comes along, drunk on self-importance, that chaos ensues. A few final notes trickled in after Karen's downfall. I heard she'd moved out of Briarwood Estates, or was planning to. One rumor said she was served with a hefty personal lawsuit for misappropriating HOA funds. Another rumor said her husband had demanded they relocate to another city, embarrassed by her behavior. The details didn't matter much to me. All I needed to know was that I had my peace back, and the war she'd declared was over. These days, when I walk my property line, I'm met with the familiar hush of farmland and the distant hum of suburban life. A hum, not a roar. The orchard is thriving, and my goats wander happily without fear of new fences. The bounty of fruit and vegetables goes to market each weekend, and a portion of the harvest still finds its way to the local food pantry. I sleep well at night, free from the barrage of petty complaints and county notices. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that sometimes you have to stand your ground against bullies, even when it's uncomfortable. Karen tried intimidation, legal threats, even trespassing, and lost. She forgot the power of good neighbors who see through the lies, and the strength of a community that values honesty over fear-mongering. And in the end, that's the sweetest form of karma. The truth standing tall, rooted deep like an old oak on farmland that's seen generations pass and will see many more. The end.